What up everyone, Shark here. Welcome back to the channel. This past weekend, I casted the MetaPlays 2v2 tournament alongside my buddy Olvadi, and this tournament featured several of the world's best Broken Arrow players, to include a couple that had achieved rank 1 on the leaderboard. And even though this was a 2v2 tournament and 2v2 plays out a little bit different than 5v5, I feel like after watching this gameplay, it really distilled Broken Arrow down to the fundamentals. So what I've got for you today is a rundown of the lessons that we can all take away from watching the highest level players in this format. I'm going to start with micro tips and tricks and then kind of move into some of the more macro subjects, how you think about deck building, how you think about economy, etc. Especially for the micro stuff, there will be plenty of footage in the background demonstrating what I'm talking about, but feel free to treat especially the back end of this as more of a podcast. I want to be respectful of your time and attention. So timestamps in the description below. And without further ado, let's start with an overview of the differences between 2v2 and 5v5. Okay, so obviously as a 2v2 tournament compared to the standard 5v5 gameplay, there were some changes. First of all, in terms of the rules, the phases were 10 minutes apiece instead of 15, and the reward income for objective points at the end of each phase was reduced to 50% of the normal value. That was just to kind of adjust the balance of the game. I actually really like the 10-minute phases. This compared with the smaller maps, because there's less distance that your units have to drive onto the field to reach the front line, made it more compelling, probably to play, but definitely to watch than if you'd been playing it on a standard sized map. Also, the maps were played on the small version of the map. So this is something, if you go into a custom game mode, still Balalaika has different map variations. And so you choose your map, you can go into the settings and choose small, you can adjust the resource income, etc. So by choosing the smaller maps, you got, it was a little bit more suited to a 2v2. Now, the maps are still comparatively larger. So in a 2v2 on a small map, each player is responsible for more territory, not just territory points, but kind of more of the map than you would be in a 5v5 on a standard map. And so this additional space forces the players to spread out a little bit more. And so it kind of prevents, great massing of firepower, and probably led to artillery being a little bit less useful in this game than it is normal in a 5v5. But some other things that I noticed just from the 2v2 game mode compared to 5v5. One, obviously, infiltration reconnaissance is much more difficult to counter because there's so much more terrain. It's easier if your micro is good and your read of the terrain is good to move recon units around. But this does impose a micro tax, and because you're responsible for more of the map, it is a little bit more difficult, requires a little bit more skill to do reconnaissance correctly. The next piece is there isn't the crutch of having a large team to make up for either poor deck composition or poor army composition. Your teammate can help you, but if how you play requires your teammate to rotate off of their lane completely, the game's over, you've lost, right? It's a lot less forgiving than in 5v5. But we'll talk about that later, because I think that informs how you should play in a standard match. And then finally, one thing I noticed, the air tax in 2v2 seemed a lot less important, right? You needed something to make sure that you didn't give up early recon or early airstrikes to the enemy or helicopter insertion, but you didn't see the spam of air units that you sometimes see in the 5v5 game. So not crazy differences overall, but enough that it changes the gameplay. And like I said, kind of distills Broken Arrow down to its core mechanics, which makes it really good for learning tips and tricks to improve your gameplay. So the first micro tip that I want to talk about is the idea that, especially in a 2v2, when you have to not only cover a little bit more area, but be prepared for more or less anything at any given time, you saw players essentially using single units a lot more versus groups, and each unit had its very specific role. And so some of this gets into the deck building, which we'll talk about later. But I think there's a temptation, especially in 5v5s, to try to mass a lot of good generalist units, whether that's BMPs with infantry or heavy armor like T90s or M1A2s, and then just kind of drive on the enemy. I'm certainly guilty of this. One of my favorite things to do is to try to drive into the enemy's back line and just smash everything in sight while they try to reconstitute. But at this level of play, you can really see the value of a few singular, very capable units being used for exactly their role, right? So there are a couple examples here of a single SHORAD just presenting enough of a threat to push off an enemy Ka-52. In a lot of cases, and you saw this kind of throughout the game, and there's an example here of, you know, an M1A2 SEP with a couple of infantry squads is plenty to lock down either an entire side of the map or in this case a territory point, right? Because the SEP can handle a lot of different threats and just a couple of squads there, but that one SEP is better than like 3 or 4 for a whole host of reasons, right? And so this gets into like how to really employ tanks. And Koraske, he's got a bunch of videos coming out covering this now, but I think people have a tendency, because they want to get in tight and smash the enemy and drive through. I think tanks need to be you know, more aggressively microed, and I think the best analog for a tank is like a heavyweight boxer with really long reach, right? So your goal is to kind of keep the enemy at range. You want to like use sight blockers like buildings or forests to kind of like pie your corners and basically limit the angles where the enemy can really engage you, right? You use your APS to deal with like the one-off missiles that get lobbed at you, but you're staying at range, especially out of handheld AT range, so really like farther than 600 meters. And what you're doing here is you're trying to limit the engagements to what the tank's defenses can handle, making sure your armor's always pointed the right direction. You've got APS, you've got smoke, and then you can keep moving to avoid artillery or airstrikes and then back off when it's not in your favor. You don't want to commit and become decisively engaged, because that's how you get overwhelmed and destroyed. And if you can do this well, and I've started to incorporate this in a couple of my games, like one tank versus 3 or 4. One, it avoids the temptation to clump them up where they get smashed by cluster strikes or the, you know, cluster cruise missiles. But also it allows you to do more with the rest of your points, right? You don't have to save up 1,300 points to bring in a tank platoon. You get a single tank, use it effectively, and then use the rest of that income to get other units on the field to counter what your opponent throws at you. So something I wanted to highlight there when it comes to tanks, armor, and the idea of single units versus blobs, platoons of units. The next thing I want to talk about is really the use of long-range infantry or weapons teams. And you see this a lot in the tournament with the employment of the American Airborne NGSW or NGWS. And in this case, really, they have that 600-meter engagement range, both with their Carl Gustav and with their rifles and machine guns, which gives them an edge over most other infantry if you can position them appropriately. And so, obviously, these, you know, infantry weapons teams are better at range, but if you can seize terrain early and then you're fighting a defensive battle, that range advantage makes life really, really difficult for the enemy. One, you're not as tempted to clump your units up, which makes artillery less effective. Two, you can reach out and touch them at a range where they can't really shoot back. And then 3, as we showed in the last video, when you have these long range weapons, they normally come with a higher penetration value, right? That 10 to 20 millimeters of kinetic penetration versus 4 to 12 for short range weapons. And so what that means is that even at range, their damage doesn't drop off as much. Now at short range, they'll still get beat up, but at, you know, you can suppress, shock, panicked enemy infantry. You can attrit them as they advance. It gives you time to react, to back your guys, relocate them to different cover. And then in particular, you know, the airborne NGWS, they've got that Carl Gustav with 600-meter range, makes it really hard for opponents to push you with armor effectively. So something to kind of keep in mind. I know it might seem like a little bit of a meme to have an MMG team or a Pulemiochiki team, but they're actually pretty valuable in the right position against enemy infantry pushes. The next thing, and one of my biggest takeaways from watching this tournament, is the value of line barrages with artillery. Now, there's a lot to talk about with artillery here, but line barrage isn't something that I saw all that often in 5v5, but it is super useful in this game mode. So I have a couple of examples here in the background. The first one is the use of smoke. And so In a line barrage, it's not a creeping barrage. It just kind of fires along that line. And so there's a little bit of randomness, but with smoke in particular, it helps get a lot of smoke down quickly, right? And it does enough to break up the sight lines that it really checkmates team weapons and anti-tank missiles by allowing you to get inside their optimal engagement range. And so, smoke, everyone knows smoke is really useful when you're going to push, but a line of smoke, especially when the enemy is in entrenched position, is really valuable. And because of the way it lands, you can start to kind of move up as soon as the first couple rounds hit, but that smoke's going to be there for a long time. And I saw this used over and over again to great effect in the 2v2 tournament. The next piece is the use of line barrages with cluster munitions. And there are a couple of good examples here that I've got going on. And examples of one teammate in this example here, it's Mule helping Zulu. But what I really like about clusters is it makes it much harder for the opponent to dodge, right? If you do like a point cluster attack, maybe you get one hit. If you totally surprise the enemy, you might get two, right? But they can kind of see where the rockets are coming in and start to dodge. When you throw them down in a line, especially because the line barrage is kind of random in its distribution along the line, it really makes it hard for your opponent to dodge until he figures out where the line is actually oriented. And so when you're using, cluster munitions to try to disrupt backline, artillery, AA, or resupply operations, it is huge. You don't have to have like super precise vision or knowledge of where the enemy targets are. If you just get like one glimpse into the backline, like, oh, okay, they're doing resupply back here, it's much more efficient. A good example here is the Gimlers. Rather than throwing 6 random high explosive rockets at that supply, you can throw do a full-size barrage, so like all 6 rockets from each vehicle into a line barrage that makes it a little bit harder for the enemy to dodge, hits a wider area, but it's still like distributed in a way that allows you to direct it a little bit. I really like this. This is something I'm going to take into my personal games, and I highly recommend more use of line barrage like across the board in the future. And then finally, some of this, right, we'll talk about a little bit when we get into like the deck building, but a variety of artillery is good, right? So tube artillery obviously can't get intercepted, but it usually needs multiple hits. The upside to it is it doesn't need to resupply as often. Usually you can get multiple salvos off. Self-propelled howitzers move quickly. Rocket artillery, it takes a lot longer to aim, but it also can't get intercepted. It has good range. And I think, the best way to use the rocket artillery is to use the line barrage, especially if you got clusters. And then the ballistic and cruise missiles, right? And so this is something that you see more in 2v2 than I think maybe in 5v5. But if you're able to kind of knock back or suppress the enemy's air defense network, these can be absolutely devastating. They hit really hard, clear team weapons out of buildings, hit high value targets on the back line. And really all you need is just that gap where the enemy doesn't have a bunch of Patriots or a bunch of S-300s up to intercept them. Really, really valuable. So lots there with artillery, but definitely some of the more important takeaways from this tournament. All right, next, I want to go over some specific units that have a big impact on the game balance right now. And I'm not going to say they're overpowered, but they are dominant and really good at what they're supposed to do, and they're difficult to counter. So I want to highlight them kind of for everybody as you're looking forward. The first one from the Russian Guard specialization is the Khrizantema, right? It's essentially a BMP-3 with a missile launcher on top, but it has both anti-vehicle and anti-infantry missiles. It can ripple fire its missiles from cover, right? So it can get a first couple shots off before it's even sighted. With a nerf to APS, right? Good positioning on a couple of these can blunt entire armored pushes. Like even if you don't get the kills, you can force the enemy back because you deplete their APS and start doing some damage immediately. These can be difficult to deal with, right? Because you would think like, oh, what if I get, anti-vehicle infantry in tight? But they actually kind of hard counter them with their like anti-infantry HE missiles. Another option to hard counter is with helicopters, but usually your opponent's smart enough to keep some shore adds, whether a Tor or like a Pantsir around. So that's not necessarily going to be a great option. So the best counter that I can't take credit for this, that other players have found for these is to include, a recon unit with the ability to laser designate near your front line and to designate and hit it with and respond with artillery, ideally cluster arty. So here's the thing, you don't need to designate the vehicle itself. If you identify a position where you think a Khrizantema is, you designate the location, you call in the cluster munitions. The designation is really important because it significantly reduces the dispersion of those cluster munitions, right? And then because they're lighter skin vehicles, they're unlikely to survive. If you get mobility kills, if you get optics kills, or damage on the vehicles, super helpful. So that's kind of the first one there. Khrizantema, if you have it and you're not using it, you should be. The next unit is the TOS-1. It's basically like an artillery rocket shotgun. It can really punish infantry pushes, right? You think like, okay, I've finally gotten through. I've got my like hyper elite US infantry. We've taken the territory objective. We're kind of reconsolidating, grabbing some cover. And then this like massive rocket barrage comes in and just smashes all of your infantry. And so when used right, a TOS is really hard to deal with. You can try to counter these with artillery or airstrikes, but because most players at this level are going to be good, they're going to call in the barrage and then immediately move away. Your timing has to be perfect. You have to have good backline recon to grab these. So if instead of thinking about hitting the TOS-1 itself, you focus on eliminating its backline supply, you'll find that they have much less impact on the game. So the TOS-1, right, it needs to reload after each barrage, especially if it's used aggressively. So if you're constantly challenging the enemy's supply, right, you're not really getting too many points from it, but you can knock its rate of fire down from once every 3 or 4 minutes to once every 10 to 12 minutes. Especially these like cluster munitions, line barrages on the supply. Maybe you get some like mobility damage, you hit some other things, but that's really the weakness in the TOS-1 is the fact that it's got to constantly resupply. So hunt for enemy supply, knock that out. You'll deal with the TOS-1 barrages a lot less. You know, obviously those first 2 units coming from the guard specialization with the Russians, but the coastals also very good, especially with some of the recent buffs. But the one unit that really kind of tilts the game for coastals with Russians is the Tu-22 with the cruise missiles. And really, here's the issue with them. The cruise missiles from the Tu-22 are literally twice as fast as any other cruise missile in the game, right? And so not only are they quick, which makes them very hard to dodge, even if you see them coming, you see the smoke trail, right? And your infantry are already moving. If they're not out of the building, they're already at risk. Some of the server desync issues can make it also really difficult to consistently shoot down. So, you know, 3 missiles come in, at least one's still going to get a hit. The way you really deal with this is by not being static. Patriot Pack 3s are better than Pack 2s because they're terminal guidance versus semi-active, and they can shoot multiple missiles at a time. SHORADs or a CRAM, a combination of that can be helpful, but SHORADs like the Bradley and the Striker SHORADs are going to struggle against these cruise missiles, especially when multiples come in. In the background here, I've got, you know, Tu-22 cruise missile absolutely annihilating a linebacker SHORAD. So just something to kind of keep in mind. If you're playing coastal as Russians, you need to have this unit in your deck for fire support. It's just way too good to not use. The next one, and this isn't really, I wouldn't say this is overpowered because there are so many different variations here and the unit is really expensive, but I think some of these games really showed off the viability of the Su-57 with the cluster cruise missiles, and you can get as many as 4 on an Su-57. I don't know that I'd necessarily recommend that. Normally the build that you see is a couple of those with a couple of these anti-radiation missiles or some AA missiles or the air-to-ground, but the cluster cruise missiles are really nasty, right? They come in very, very quick. And then because they're clusters, they do a lot of damage to vehicles without having to be hyper precise. And so it's just something that like you see at the high level and you realize just how viable it is. Speed, same as the JASM, but that cluster effect, if you catch the enemy's kind of defenses out in the open or you pair it with the harms, the KH-58s, it can be really, really hard for the enemy to deal with. And so when we talk about like disrupting supply along the back line, this is a great unit for it, right? You release the harms and the cruise missiles at the same time. You rely a little bit on its stealth and its ECM to make it hard to kill and trade out. You get a couple of these in your deck from the VDV Brigade, and suddenly you've got a lot of, you know, ranged air-to-ground striking power that the enemy might not be prepared for. All right, and then on the US side, we've got this guy, the F-35A. either with, a 2,000 pound JDAM and a harm or a second JDAM, this thing is really, really difficult to counter. And in the right deck combination, soft striker in particular, you have a huge air allocation. So you can easily carry 4 of these and then a B2 or a couple F-22s, some other planes here. But right, it's kind of it's a good multi-role fighter, right? It carries some AMRAMs, so it can defend itself as it's coming in. And you will almost always get your bomb drop off. There are very few situations that I've seen where the F-35 doesn't at least release its bomb. And so if you strike appropriately, the odds of you getting in and at least trading out are really high. And then with the harm equipped with it, right, you can usually eat the first missile, self-defense missile coming off, the bomb hits, which makes the other missiles go haywire, and then the F-35 on afterburner back to base for basically free. So as a US player, especially if you're playing like soft striker and you don't have a bunch of these in your deck, you are doing your teammates a disservice. You have to have multiple and you have to keep them running constantly to harass enemies backline and start to deal with that enemy ADA and artillery network. Oh, counters for this. So it's tough. The best thing to do is to keep an anti-air fighter along the back line. And here's why. So 1.75 stealth rating, right? So your ground radar with a range of 8,000 meters, that's going to get knocked down to, I think, 5,280 if my math is correct, right? At that point, the F-35 is going to drop on you. But if you have like an Su-57, Su-35, Su-27 up and loitering in the back with its 12,000 optical range, right now you see this thing at 7,800 meters. And that's enough spotting to potentially allow you to get a couple of missiles off at it, and at the very least guarantee that you trade it out versus just losing, your artillery, your anti-air to it and watching it get away. Okay, now this is like bridging the gap between micro and macro. And so I want to talk about refunding units after you use them, in particular artillery. This is something that we saw Mule and Zulu do quite a bit throughout the tournament, right? Come in, fire a rocket barrage, and then refund the unit. And up front, I'm just going to like put it out there. It's not economically efficient to refund your units like this, right? Like you get 90% back minus the supply. Like from an economy point of view, it is like easier and more efficient in terms of points to bring in supply and resupply and then shoot again. But if you think about the game in terms of like the concept of the game in general, especially for destruction score, and kind of the tactical equivalent of, tactical value of refunding your units, the logic changes a little bit. So stay with me here because I had this explained to me and I think it makes a lot of sense, but you got to kind of like walk through it, right? So first, if the basic concept of the game is you have to try to trade points for damage, then there are some units that you want because they are designed to get you a ton of destruction value, right? So these are really your armor units, your CQC infantry, and your aircraft, right? You bring them in and the whole goal is to get way more value and destruction than the unit itself costs. Then there are other units that you either want on the field or need on the field in general, even if they aren't killing anything, because they allow your big point getters to stay alive and fight. That's your air defense, your SHORAD, your standoff infantry, your team weapons, etc. Right? It doesn't make sense to constantly cycle them on and off the field because no matter what, you need to be prepared for what your enemy can throw at you. So keep your air defense out there, keep your SHORAD out there, right? To defend your tanks, your mechanized pushes, your heavy duty infantry. But then there are some units where refunding them can make sense more often than not. And the two best examples are your artillery and your helicopters. Now, in this case, it's about tactical efficiency, not necessarily economic efficiency. It depends a lot on the situation and the map. But for something like MLRS, Gimlers, Prisms, ATACMs, whatever, if it's got a long range, then the easiest thing to do here is to bring it in, because it's like it stays on roads, moves pretty quick. Shoot the big barrage, use the line barrage, right? Hit the enemy with it and immediately send it back to base. So like I said, it moves fast. And so on most maps, if there's like a long resupply time, you can actually get it off the map and have the points to bring it back relatively quickly. if you send it back, you get most of those points back after using it, which then you can use to get other units if you need them, right? So if you bring an artillery to shoot, but your frontline units are getting depleted because they're in contact, now you get those points back. You can bring in another tank, another Bradley, another SHORAD, more infantry, etc., and you don't have to wait as long. The other big advantage here is then you're not running your units around, clumping them around supply, because there's a little bit of a micro tax involved with this. But also, if your enemy has good backline recon, they're going to find your supply points and start targeting it with artillery. And so if your units are clumped around your supply, they're kind of always at risk. But if you're bringing in enemy artillery, or you're bringing in your rocket artillery, you shoot it and then you send it back. Now you're not messing with supply and you're not risking any of your units. And now you can just use supply more tactically with your frontline units to keep them topped off. You need less of it, etc. So, to me, this makes sense. The other example that was highlighted to me are helicopters, right? You bring in a couple of helicopters, you move in, you get some quick kills with them, and then you try to get them away, because they're usually pretty expensive units, especially if you invest in like high-end weaponry, ECM, etc. You refund them, but your opponent, meanwhile, is like, oh crap, he has 2 Guardians and 2 DAPs or a bunch of killer eggs. Now I got to get SHORADs out, or I got to get manpad squads to deal with it. You withdraw those helicopters, replace them with armor, and now your enemy's hard counter doesn't have anything on the field to fight. So, and see, my dog like really agrees with this point. It's something that I want to try, like I said, more viable probably in 2v2s or on smaller maps than 5v5s, but give it a shot. I think you'll find it gives you a lot more tactical flexibility. Okay, so now we're going to get into the really kind of like fun big brain stuff here. What everyone wants to talk about is deck construction. And I'm not going to review the entire deck, but I'm going to use a couple of columns to kind of identify what you should be thinking about and what makes a good deck versus a mediocre deck. And the first tendency that I think a lot of players have is they put units in their deck that they want to use. And I am 100% guilty of this, but what you really want to do is not get tunnel vision on having like the coolest units available, but think about what the enemy can throw at you and what you have available to deal with those problems. It's something I've talked about before, but I feel like the decks and the army composition that we saw in the tournament really kind of exemplified this. And so I'm just going to go over kind of the vehicle tab here. And this is a deck from one of the competitors, an airborne armor deck. In case you're wondering, Armor Soft was banned in most of the matches, so Armor Airborne was the equivalent deck that got used quite a bit, and that actually gives some additional options for the US players. But so first off, you've got the M901A3. This is your tow launcher. One thing I want to highlight: use of the standard tow 2 versus the top attack. It's got the higher penetration. You see this quite a bit because what you're trying to do with this is control terrain and push, punish enemy tanks or BMPs that are moving aggressively. And the frontal attack is good against everything except the highest end tanks. And even then you're going to challenge their APS. So a couple of those, a couple of SEP V3s with Tusk 2, but without the trophy package, right? And so this is really designed to deal with heavy armor where you aren't worried as much about missiles or ATGMs coming in. And it's because it's got the best gun in the game with the highest kinetic penetration, allows you to do some damage to the really elite, in this case, Russian armor. That's what it's designed to counter. They also have 2 SEP V2s with the trophy package. So gun is still good, but now this is a little bit more of a multi-role tank. And it's slightly more expensive, but it's definitely not as expensive as if you had the SEP V3 with the trophy, right? So this allows you to get into the deck and get have a variety of units out, but you have to use the right unit for the right situation. So in this case, this is your like multi-role tank to deal with lighter vehicle pushes. If you're worried about Barbaros, Terminator, BMP, etc. And it can also stand off and deal with some infantry as long as, again, you keep your tanks kind of at range, at arm's length. Next are the Sheridans, right? And these obviously only available to the airborne deck, but these are your answer to like BMP spam for a couple of reasons. One, at 75 points a piece, they are super cheap, but they come with these like HE pure versus heat rounds. So they've got enough penetration to do damage to all but the heaviest armored vehicles, and then they've got these lower penetration but high damage weapons to deal with the infantry that pop out, and they, like I said, they're super cheap. The other thing is you actually don't want to equip the Shalala missiles, and that's because at range the tank's going to prefer to fire these missiles first, which are essentially a waste. You get 300 of additional meters of range, but APS are going to nullify these almost entirely. So better off to keep them cheap. You can get 4 of them out, and we saw players from multiple teams use these to great effect to deal with the Russian VMP spam that can otherwise be a challenge. And then finally, you've got the assault breacher here with the Miklik. This is to help you clear infantry out of buildings. It's very durable with its armor. You can get it in close. You're not as reliant on artillery because you have this system here in your deck. So just in this vehicle column alone, you see a lot of variety and an answer to pretty much every threat that the enemy can throw at you, with the exception of, like helicopters, but that's all in the support tab. And then again, without trying to get too much into it, you just see kind of the variety here. You've got some air defense, you've got some shore edge, you've got some rocket artillery with clusters, you've got some tube artillery, not the Iron Thunders, but the Paladins for kind of the versatility. You got Brutus, etc. So again, you have like, instead of like 4, SEP V3s, 4 SEP V2s, and that's your entire vehicle column, instead you've got a couple of multiple different vehicles, and that really allows you to be effective and to choose the right tool for the problem set. All right, so we're in the last section here, which I kind of lumped together into like phasing, timing, or team play. And this is really just kind of a collection of thoughts, really from like an academic perspective on things to consider as you're playing the game to make you better at the game. And you can make progress, you can play at high elo, you can win games without having to play a lot of games if you're very deliberate, if you make good decisions, and if you think, if you understand the game mechanics and really kind of the core concepts. So I'm going to really kind of dive into like the academic intellectual approach here, again relying on kind of the experience and the guidance of some of these super high level players. And so this is like a great time if you just kind of want to throw this on in the background. And please, like, as we get through this, if you have thoughts or comments, like, throw them down below, because I really I enjoy the discussion here. So the first thing, and this is actually a line that Smoko hit me with a couple weeks ago when I was playing and was throwing units away. You have to have units to play the game, right? And it sounds kind of flippant and funny, but it's super obvious in the 2v2 format. But I think it's still really relevant to 5v5 because of the way the game is scored and played out. Throwing units away without positive trade value is the fastest way to lose this game, right? So if, in a 5v5, if you lose your lane, sometime your teammates can come over and help you, or you can kind of take a second to rebuild because the enemy might not take advantage of that space. They might not know that they've totally kind of shut you out. And so you can get lucky and the enemy might not put a ton of pressure on you. But in a 2v2, there's nowhere to hide. If one of the players loses their game, the game is over, right? And so think about play a 5v5 that way, right? Don't ever commit so hard that you just get completely rolled off the map, because if you lose your lane against good opponents, they're going to leverage that. They're going to put additional pressure on your teammates. They're going to take advantage of the lack of pressure on your side. And you're just going to end up kind of like throwing units into the breach, really getting hurt on destruction score, giving up territory. It's how the game ends. If you shift out of your lane too hard, that can also be very risky. And so this definitely applies more to 2v2. But if you swing over to help a teammate like on the opposite side of the map and you give up your side completely, this is really risky, because it'll either take a very slow and deliberate advance with a lot of recon and probing to get back into where you're supposed to hold, or you'll just kind of have to throw an unga bunga armored push in that's not going to trade really well. And so that's another way to kind of doom your team to late phase failure, is if you give up presence in your lane. So like any good RTS team game, you want to be able to help your teammates. You want to have success that allows you to turn things into like a 2v1 or a 3v1. But just keep in mind, you don't ever want to abandon the terrain that you're expected to hold. And this is one of the reasons why hardcore support decks usually have high KDs but really low win rates is, and I'm planning on talking about this quite a bit, but you're not supporting, you're allowing the opponent to put on a bunch of pressure, and you might trade well from a destruction perspective, but you're really letting your teammates kind of bear the brunt of a lot of that pressure. One thing that was on display constantly during the tournament was teams timing their pushes and knowing when to push and knowing when to hold terrain. And, the tendency is either to push constantly, right, going for that like sudden death victory, but all right, we've got our side of the map, so let's keep rolling, or to push really hard at the end of a phase to try to grab territory points. Instead, I think the better way to approach this, and you saw this at the very, very high level, is to focus more on tactical positioning, right? So unless you think about it this way, unless you completely lose the first two phases, like you give up all 6 objective points in both first 2 phases, phase 3, there are enough points available that you can make it up as long as you have good positioning. And so really what we saw kind of across the board is the team that had like 55 to 60% of the map control going into phase 3 almost always won the game, because at that point, the enemy is kind of stuck. They have to trade massive destruction score to try to gain that territory back, and then they are, they culminate, right? If you want to use the doctrinal term, they lose a lot of elements, or they have to resupply, and they're very vulnerable to a quick counterattack. In addition, in this game, overextension, especially in some of the larger maps, means these super long reinforce times for you and shorter for the enemy. So if you push too far forward and then you end up getting driven back, there's not enough time at the end of the game, at the end of the phase, to get more ground units out to capture that. And then when attacking, rather than, go for these big, like all-in pushes on a regular basis, the more successful teams do constant little probing attacks, right? Not always necessarily focused on territory points themselves, but on some of the like other key terrain with just a couple of units supported by Recon. And when you do this, you keep your opponent off balance. You force them to constantly kind of react to you and your actions. You keep them from being able to double on your teammate because they have to pay attention to what you're doing. And then in the event that you catch them without being strong pointed, it can help you identify a situation for a full push where you can take additional terrain. The other benefit is usually it helps you identify some of their stronger like team weapons that Recce might not spot if they're in a forest or they're in a building, so to line up for other strikes, whether it's cruise missiles or artillery. And then I mentioned this previously, but a lot of these maps have what I would consider key terrain that isn't a territory control point. So like compare this game to something like Dawn of War of Company of Heroes, where owning terrain actually produces resources for you. Owning terrain in this game only matters at the end of the phase, or when you're trying to force the opponent to attack into you. And that's like the only value that the territory points actually have. There are plenty of locations in these maps where it's a good tactical position that's not an objective point. So think like the high ground on the north side in Ruda, the high rises in pretty much all of the urban maps, the plateau in Baltisk, right? These should be objectives kind of in and of themselves. And so if your opponent is overly committed to controlling the objective points, but you identify the key terrain, you can exploit this to kind of take control of the map from them without fighting directly over territory points. And so this can be really advantageous when their defense is focused on like the territory points themselves, and you can get yourself into an advantageous position by working around them. The other really good example of this kind of concept are the airport or airfield maps. Controlling the airstrip itself is huge, right? It's like a huge open area, a very clean line of sight. And so if you own it and you have good control and good recon on it, anytime the enemy tries to cross it or use it to like support teammates back and forth in 2v2s and 5v5s, it doesn't matter. You can attrit them, you can spot, you can designate, and you can rotate easily, but the enemy can't. So, as a rule, like the airport itself, the airstrip isn't worth any objective points, but it's worth a ton in terms of the tactical advantage it provides you. And then kind of in the vein of terrain and working with your teammates, something that alluded to a little bit is the idea of like owning one side or the other of the map and not getting rolled on your side. And so one thing that I saw the better teams do in the 2v2 tournament was refuse to get spread out too much. Right? So you'd have one player, usually with a more like defensive deck setup, would focus in the center, and then the more aggressive player would focus on one of the flanks. And then over time, they would eventually kind of shift to the other flank. But by limiting their initial objectives, they didn't get so spread up that they couldn't answer the problems that the enemy was creating for them. But the other thing I want to point out is sometimes in the game, it can be tempting to like split your attention and say, all right, I'm going to hold this here, but I'm going to go over to the other side of the map and help my teammate. And that's really dangerous in Broken Arrow. I like this game a lot, but the audio and visual cues for when your units are in contact are really bad, especially when compared to other games where they are constantly feeding you information. And so if something's not right in front of your face, the odds of you being able to micro that engagement appropriately are really low. So I really recommend that you don't try to split your attention. There's actually one of the matches earlier on in the 2v2, I forget exactly who was playing, but they got beat on one side, and so the player rotated over the opposite side, and it just led to a complete collapse. The other thing here is, like, even at 5v5, you only have 1,000 points, right? If you don't have the starting points to do everything right, that balance is more important than being spread across the map. So really recommend that you don't try to cover too much ground initially, and then you definitely don't try to split your attention. Try to keep your units semi-coherent on one side of the map, so it's easier to keep track of everything that's going on. And then the final kind of macro thing that we saw throughout the tournament was the use of reconnaissance. And I know I've got like a separate recon guide, but watching these players, especially when they had to control a large portion of the map, I basically split the recon activities into 3 categories. You have your assault recon, which these are the units that travel with your combat units to spot for them to maximize your engagement range, to laser designate when it's possible, right? Then you have your infiltration recon, and these are the units that you try to get into the back line. And I think these were the most important recon units in the 2v2 tournament, right? Because they're not back there like, my favorite thing to do with snipers is get them in the back line and laser designate artillery for deep strikes, and like, that's cool, but good players will identify what's happening and counter recce you. But in this case, a lot of times you saw 1 or 2 units would get on the back line and never give away their position. But now they can see all the different units spawning onto the battlefield, and so they can react faster. Right? You see a bunch of tanks, you see some SHORADs, you see a bunch of air defense come out, right? Or helicopters, right? You can see that early and get the counters into place before the enemy can really push with what they have. So the infiltration recon in the 2v2 tournament was critical, and that's something that I think in 5v5s you can use, especially if you're playing a flank position, to get an advantage on your enemy. And then finally, we just saw outstanding use of counter recon as well. Every team kind of had like a battle drill or a response when they realized they'd been infiltrated on the back line. So you see a little bit here with like the multiple Kiowas or multiple DAPs going around, clearing the back line, looking for enemy scout units. You know, pretty well understood, but the disciplined approach to it is what made it effective and helped those teams kind of win the recon fight. All right, so that wraps it up for this video. I do want to thank, obviously, MetaPlays and Olvadi for incorporating me into the cast, for hosting such an awesome tournament. I really enjoyed this game format. This is something that I'm going to use in the future in like in-house games to help hone skills and focus on specific tactics or specific maps. I want to throw a congrats to the winning team, Mule and Zulu. Their final against Benji and Nub was a lot of fun and really back and forth. Thanks to everyone who played and then contributed their thoughts to this video, in particular Dressel and Mule, for all the analysis. Links to everything mentioned here, the Twitch, YouTube channels below, Barmary for their recent development, match analysis, match performance analysis. All of this stuff is up on the MetaPlays Twitch and my personal Twitch if you want to go back and watch the VODs and watch the matches live with the casting. It was a lot of fun. So that is going to do it for us here, folks. Hope you learned a lot. I know I did. And we'll see y'all in the next one.